Explained by the Billy Meier contacts, mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more, compiled by David Chance, revised July 2, 2025.
Future Earth Humans Part 17. See also Gilgamesh. See also Hyperborea, Hyperboreans. See also Ica Stones. See also Longskulls. See also Men in Black. See also Nazca Lines. See also Nokodemion. See also Ptah. See also Quetzalcoatl. See also Rods. See also Starchild Skull. See also Teos Caves Metal Library. See also Tunguska Event 1908. See also UFOs Flying Saucers. Contact Report 251.
The history of Henok and Nokodemion is widely known in our group, and various things can also be read in the OM. But what happened around Henok about 1.2 billion years ago, in terms of his peoples, has never been said before. From Henok's primitive peoples, two lineages divided out. After the Great Reparation actions, after the peace struggles by the peace troops were over, and all peoples and planets were pacified. One lineage went its long way to the Lyra regions, where they settled in a space-time continuum offset by a fraction of a second by another space-time continuum, where they lived from then on, but only after they had inhabited other worlds and systems in various other areas of foreign galaxies for many billions of years, as a result of which warfare then again developed. In this episode, again space-wide emigrations of peoples were carried out, which finally ended in another space-time continuum, which is shifted by a fraction of a second to our space-time continuum, whereby the area was located in the space of the Lyra stars, which is why today one still speaks of the Lyra regions, and of the old Lyrans, who then returned at a later time again, partly in an expeditionary form and partly hastily, into our space-time continuum, in which consequence they came then also to the Earth, in order to work here in known wise. This lineage has retained the entire knowledge of their original origins to this day, and this lineage also gave rise to the Pleiadians, respectively the Plejaran, who in their language call themselves the same as they call their celestial cluster beyond the Pleiades, which is also shifted a fraction of a second in relation to our space-time continuum in another space-time continuum. The second lineage now, which split off from the native peoples of Henok about 1.2 billion years ago, went completely different ways than the Lyran group, if I may say so. This lineage also emigrated to other galaxies, according to which they then already lost their actual origin about 7,700,000,000. See me, 7 million years ago, so they are absolutely bereft today of their actual knowledge of origin, which is why a new origin legend was created by its chroniclers and historians, etc., which has nothing more or only very little in common with the truth. This lineage also consisted of many different races, as was the case with the Lyran lineage. In contrast to the Lyrans, however, who always remained ready to fight, but developed more and more into a form of balance, from which the peaceful and balanced, highly developed Pleiadians emerged, the other lineage reached this goal very early, whereby it completely lost its fighting ability and consequently became more and more defenseless against aggressors. Resulting from this, they settled again into an emigration of all peoples, and settled the areas of the Sirius constellation, where the factor of the loss of the past or the knowledge of their origin happened again. Once again, a new prehistory of origin was compiled and incorporated into the annals. This lineage spread far in the Sirius area and developed higher and higher, whereby it even became capable of creating new life themselves. Having become incapable of fighting, they bred new and genetically manipulated human races, which were capable of fighting and could protect them from aggressors who appeared again and again. Note: see the entry for Contact Report 649 further below for additional information. These new human races were made into forms of life by intervening genetic manipulations, which carried barbaric traits up to the degeneration and mercilessness in themselves, whose life, however, was limited to only about 100 years. Likewise, genetically manipulated, out of the justified fear and precaution that the gene-manipulated ones could flock together against their producers and rulers and destroy these. A fear that then also proved to be true, which is why new means were sought to bring the genetically manipulated races back under control, even if this had to be through radical extermination. And since the creator rulers were more powerful than the genetically manipulated ones, the genetically manipulated ones could do was to flee, with the help of the well-meaning ones fleeing the serious lands, while the well-meaning ones secretly became avenged to take advantage of the genetically manipulated as well. Thus, two great races of genetically manipulated peoples fled the serious lands and settled beyond the sun, meaning that they settled on very remote solar systems. They settled and established themselves on planets beyond the galactic central sun, the Milky Way central sun, in order to be discovered there one day by space travelers of the old Lyran lineage, after which they emigrated into the Lyra areas and finally came, only in recent Earth history, to these planets, where they settled in China and Japan, etc., and formed the Chinese and Japanese peoples, from which different new branches and/or so-called races resulted. The rest of the peoples who were genetically manipulated found their way from the Sirius areas to the SOL system, where several thousand rebellious genetically manipulated peoples were punitively abandoned in many diverse places on the Earth, while the masses of the numerous different races of peoples found a new home on the planets Mars and Melona/Phaeton, where they built cities, pyramids and stations, etc. The people who had been genetically manipulated had to leave the planet, even in ancient times, after which they settled on the Earth, and in the course of time became Earth humans, whose real and actual origin lay in the regions and on the planets of Sirius. However, pyramids and gigantic monuments remained on Mars, as well as stations that remained in function for a long time after the death of Mars, but were also abandoned and decayed over time. But all this cannot be found one day by Earth humans, the gene-manipulated ones, and cannot be partially put back into operation. Melona, that is to say Phaeton, on the other hand, was destroyed by its genetically manipulated and former Sirius area inhabitants in fratricidal wars and caused to explode by leading a river or sea into the subterranean, that is to say, submarine magma chambers of a gigantic volcano. The asteroid belt contains the remnants of the former planet, which at that time did not orbit where the asteroid belt is today, but at the place where Mars orbits the Sun today, while Mars was where the asteroid belt is today. This change of position was caused by gigantic upheavals, in which the destroyer was also involved. The places, that is to say the planets and solar systems, where the two yellow races settled beyond the galaxy, the Milky Way, as well as Mars. Earth and Melona/Phaeton had been chosen as effective hiding places by the well-meaning ones, by the escape helpers of the genetically manipulated ones, and had been kept secret from the creator rulers for all past time. Because if they had found out the whereabouts of the ones who had fled, then they would have sent out punitive expeditions to have the refugees eliminated. This danger may still exist today. Therefore, it is and was extremely reckless of the Americans to launch probes with position data of the Earth and with human descriptions into the world's space, because if these, by some stupid circumstance, get into the hands of the creator rulers, and they thereby receive knowledge of the fact that the gene-manipulated ones, the terrestrial humans, survived and multiplied enormously over all the millions of years, then it must be reckoned with under certain circumstances that attacks from the Sirius regions upon the Earth and Earth humans will be started, which could result in a total elimination, whereby also the well-meaning ones, who withdrew already long ago again, would not hurry to help, because also they began to fear the gene-manipulated ones, the Earth humans, already after a short time of their activity, just as the creator rulers had done before. Annotation Ptah from the 6th of January 2005. This danger has meanwhile demonstrably resolved itself, and there are only about 60 distant descendants of those who had created the genetically manipulated ones, and who had them tracked during their flight. These are the group of extraterrestrials called the Men in Black, but they are not identical with the earthly men in black, who are state-controlled. The populations of today's Sirius regions, which are located in space-time configuration offset to the earthly dimension, have settled the old feuds against the genetically manipulated ones, have become peaceful, and are no longer interested in tracking down and taking revenge on the distant descendants of the genetically manipulated ones. This fear, which also seized the well-meaning ones, led them to erase the tradition of origin lore of the Earth humans by all sorts of manipulations, in order to elevate themselves as gods, and to rise above the Earth humans in this form, who fell subject to them in a short time and became believers in them. In this manner, the well-meaning ones, who soon turned truthfully into the opposite, hoped, on the one hand, to be able to make the genetically manipulated ones subservient to them again, and, on the other hand, they hoped that through the worship of the gods, cults, and religions, as well as feuds, that fratricidal wars, family wars, and people's wars, etc., would arise, and the Earth humans, the gene-manipulated ones, would decimate and exterminate themselves, whereby they, the gods, or the once well-meaning ones, would become released from the danger of the militant, barbaric life form of the Earth humans. A project that failed thoroughly, because the Earth human, who in the meantime had become stronger and more intelligent, more barbaric and more insidious, liked their role more and more and defended it as well as their lives with all imaginable and always new means up to the death. Thus, the genetically manipulated ones and now the Earth humans got completely out from the control of the former good-minded ones or gods, which is why they withdrew from the Earth humans and from the Earth, with the oath of revenge that one day they would demand accountability from the Earth humans. This retreat opened the way for the ancient Lyrans to come to Earth and to the Earth humans. When they left their space-time structure in expedition and in flight, and came to our space-time structure, and to the SOL system, and thus to the Earth, in order to act as deities and to wreak havoc. However, the former well-meaning of the genetically manipulated knew and know nothing of this, nor of the existence of the Pleiadians or the Pleiaren. Annotation. Ptah from the 6th of January 2005. The former well-meaning humans who had become enemies of the genetically manipulated ones have meanwhile also changed for the better and have come to good sense. They have returned to the Sirius regions. The Earth humans, the genetically manipulated ones, were however also disobedient to the Lyran and Pleiadian gods, even if some of these gods wanted to forcefully put the Earth humans under their yoke and their rule, like for example the Giza intelligences and Ashtar Shiran and cohorts. The former well-meaning ones were also divided into two groups. One, which swore revenge and became of a different mind, and the other, which remained well-meaning towards the Earth humans, and which also wants to return someday. But only these gods know what this will result in the future for one or the other group. If they really come back one day, then nothing good is to be expected from those who have changed from the well-meaning to the evil-minded, but who, despite their change to evil, could not return to their original home in the Sirius regions, because they became outcasts there through their treacherous actions, who since then have also had to be careful not to let the former creator rulers know the place of their existence, because they too fell into their vengeance spell. Despite their departure from the Earth and from the SOL system, these former well-meaning ones, who are addicted to vengeance, still have certain contacts with the Earth and occasionally come here, maliciously influencing Earthlings with false messages and visions, etc., as was also done by the dark elements of the ancient Lyrans. But these are only occasional intrigues, which, as a rule, take place in cultic religious sectarian form and have no all too great significance, because they generally only take place in a Christian cultic manner, and therefore not in all earthly religious areas. The two groups of the former and the still today well-meaning ones have, already since their separation, had no more contacts with each other, and it is even very probable that such mutual contacts were strictly forbidden, whereby even the knowledge about the existence of the two groups among each other was extinguished, as Quetzal once assured me, according to secret clarifications from the Plejaran side. Note Ptah from 6 January 2005. Regarding this evil-minded group, we are talking about the approximately 60 extraterrestrial men in black, who, however, have since the year 2002 no longer had any possibility whatsoever to cause any harm on the Earth, because the Plejaran deprived them of all possibilities for doing so. If we now take a closer look at the genetic manipulations that were carried out on special humans by the creator rulers in the Sirius regions in order to establish combat-capable peoples, then it is quite astonishing. The creator rulers themselves had lost all combat capability through their evolution, which was oriented only to prosperity, knowledge and ability, etc., while the combat power and combat capability were completely disregarded. So any power to do so was lost, as were the abilities themselves. When aggressors appeared, however, they threatened to destroy the highly developed peoples, so they had to find a solution to defend themselves against the attackers. As a result, humans were begotten, to whom through genetic manipulations all conceivable possibilities for the ability to fight were implanted, as well as carefully also the factor of the aging process that these genetic manipulated ones did not become very old, but died prematurely again, whereby it was to be prevented that they could flock together one day and take action against the creator rulers. A precautionary measure that soon proved to be justified, because the genetically manipulated ones became more and more self-propagated, because their genetic manipulation was hereditary for all future generations. As a result of the increasing population of the gene-manipulated ones on the other hand, and as a result of the increasing aggression of the gene-manipulated ones towards the creator rulers on the other hand, those capable of fighting always became a greater danger, which is why new means were sought to eliminate them. But before the right means were found, the majority of the genetically manipulated ones were able to flee and really get to safety with the help of the well-meaning ones, as I have already explained. Since then, the genetically manipulated ones have become so established on the Earth that they have become both rulers and destroyers of this planet, because most of them are still very much caught up in the effects of the genetic manipulation for the combative, the malignant, the barbaric, the bloodthirsty, the greedy, the addicted, the emotional and the inhuman, etc., which has prevailed as an evil inheritance since time immemorial, which can actually also be called original sin, as misleadingly stated by the Christian religion with the fable and false doctrine of Adam and Eve and the devil serpent in the Garden of Eden. But this original sin, this genetic manipulation, which caused the combative and evil in the human being to break through, over and over again since time immemorial, and makes him or her almost become evil themselves, is really only a manipulation of a gene in the DNA chain, which can be reversed if it is only finally discovered by the genetic scientists. This genetic manipulation, which is peculiar to all human beings living on the Earth today because it is inevitably passed on through inheritance, can thus be reversed, whereby the human being then finally loses the evil which has become peculiar to him or her through manipulation. Although science has not yet progressed so far in this respect, it is still on the right path, which in itself justifies the ever more advancing genetic research and genetic manipulation of our time, against which ignorant ones, etc., so vehemently resist and idiotically preach religious nonsense against something they cannot prevent or stop, but only that genetic manipulation has to be reversed in the human being on the Earth that makes him or her degenerate into murder and manslaughter, bloodlust, hatred, greed, and addiction, and in all that is inhuman. However, the genetic manipulation for the combativeness and the ability to fight in the creation given, lawful in recommendation sense must not be reversed, because this ability to fight is necessary for the survival and the evolution. So the same must not happen as with the creator rulers, who robbed themselves of their fighting ability by genetic manipulation, whereby they lost all fighting power and were no longer able to defend themselves against aggressors when they were attacked, which resulted in the monstrous fact that humans were manipulated practically into fighting machines by genetic modification, from which then again new problems arose. If one now considers the human beings who were genetically modified into fighting machines, then these were human beings who were specially conceived for this purpose by the Creator. Rulers, who were indeed outright bred for this purpose. In other words, quite normal, but already highly evolved human beings. Physically, they were rudimentarily changed through genetic manipulation, whereby old physical characteristics appeared again, whereby they became extremely resistant against environmental influences, etc., and showed a certain wildness. With all the genetic manipulations, however, it was omitted to also manipulate the gene of the factor that is responsible for recognizing, remembering, understanding, and obeying the creational, natural laws and recommendations, and thus that which is balanced and good. This omission was done deliberately because it had been researched that this residual factor would offer a certain security against a complete degeneration of the gene-manipulated ones, whereby on the one hand something human would always influence life and actions, etc., whereby also a certain guarantee would be given that the gene-manipulated ones would not be maliciously directed against their creator rulers. These wishes did not come true, but in the sense that the genetically manipulated ones did not completely dehumanize and therefore did not completely degenerate. Through the remaining factor, the well-balanced or good has repeatedly penetrated the consciousness of the genetically manipulated ones since time immemorial, as a result of which evil has lost more and more of its significance over the course of millions of years, but is still clearly recognizable today, which is particularly evident in certain rulers, criminals and despots, etc. Unfortunately, it had not been taken into account that genetic manipulation and the naturally existing factor of balance and goodness in humans had to result in a state of conflict, or at least of being torn back and forth, as has been observed since time immemorial, and has always appeared again, as is still the case with many human beings today. Through this genetic manipulation, the human beings has fought in himself or herself between good and evil since time immemorial, whereby evil often wins. Nevertheless, more and more human beings struggle for good by defeating the damage caused by genetic manipulation and the evil genome, evil or original sin. Unfortunately, however, this often happens again in a degeneration which is based on a softness and a false humanism, because the right way is not found and thus false ideals are followed, which often arise through religious sectarian nonsense. If one now wants to explain the different skin colors of the different human beings here on the earth in more detail, then actually not much needs to be said about it anymore, because after all that has been explained so far, it should be clear that different humans and their skin colors originated in the most different planetary systems of our galaxy, the Milky Way, whereby the Sirius areas play a special role. This, at least, concerns the actual origin, before the old Lyrans came to the earth and mixed with the Earth humans, of whom many distant descendants of that time live here on this planet. And what can still be said about the actual genetic manipulators can be explained as follows. These were actually the well-meaning ones of the genetically manipulated ones, and thus the creator rulers of the same themselves. But they divided into two parties when it came to whether the genetically manipulated ones should ultimately be killed or simply banished. So one party fought with the other in fierce verbal battles and accusations until other intelligent beings of the Sirius territories interfered, to which the party of those who were in favor of killing the genetically manipulated ones joined. The really well-intentioned ones, the killing opponents, succeeded, however, in spite of many countermeasures of the ones who wanted to kill, to save large parts of the gene-manipulated ones in several groups through escape, whereby, as already explained, two peoples were settled beyond the Sun, central galactic sun on the other side of the galaxy, while the remaining peoples found a new homeworld in the Sol system, on Mars and on Melona each, while several thousand degenerating gene-manipulated ones were abandoned on the Earth. Even then, the well-meaning ones knew that the human beings brought here could not remain in this solar system forever, but would one day have to migrate again, because the sun of this remote system was a star that was already dying and had been chosen for this very reason, because the serious intelligences and the creator rulers, who had become willing to kill, did not suspect that the territory of a dying sun would be chosen for repopulation for the degenerate and God's workers, as they were called by the creator rulers. So, enormous distances were laid between the home planets of the gene-manipulated ones in the Sirius regions and the Sol system, as well as the distant system beyond the galaxy, to protect them from those who threatened them with death and elimination. The selected hiding places had therefore been chosen so far outside of the galaxy. Another decisive factor was the fact that, in addition to the dying sun, the living conditions on the SOL planets and on the planets in the system beyond the galaxy were also very poor, because the breathable air on none of the newly colonized planets corresponded to the original breathing air composition of the home planets. A fact that is still the case today on the Earth, where the air does not meet the standard of human respiratory needs. So the fact of the dying sun, as well as the poor living conditions and the poor breathing air, was reason enough to seek hiding places from the pursuers here in the SOL system and beyond the galaxy. And here in the SOL system, far away from Sirius and the planets and intelligences there, the genetically manipulated ones have been eking out their existence ever since, begetting their offspring and inexorably evolving now as Earthlings who will soon be able to set out on their own, in order to penetrate into the vastness of the universe, from whence they originally came, quite contrary to the inadequate assertions of Earth scientists that the Earth human of today's form is an original product of the Earth, and even, according to Charles Darwin's lowly intelligent primitive false teaching, descended from apes. Although purely Earth-created human beings live on the Earth, on the one hand, they have their own evolutionary lineage independent of apes, while on the other hand, apes are descended from the first or early human beings. But also these purely Earthborn ones are today afflicted with the genetic heritage, with the so-called original sin, if one can really call it that, which also applies to all those humans who, in earlier times, originated from out of the old Lyrans who died on the Earth, and also from Pleiadians/Pleiaren. All of them, all extraterrestrials who stayed on the Earth and died here, never returned to their homeworlds. Their spirit forms slipped into the earthly realm of the afterlife, and since then have reincarnated again, and again into newly forming bodies of human beings who were born on the Earth, and consequently also with the damage of the former genetic manipulation by the Syrian creator rulers, because the genetic manipulated also diligently produced descendants on the Earth among themselves, and together with the pure Earthlings, whereby the degenerate genetic material unstoppably spread into the entire humanity of planet Earth. The creator rulers, however, who were originally also human beings of this kind, committed the madness of eliminating their own genes in themselves, thereby losing all their ability to fight and resist, and also aligning their entire thinking and acting accordingly, with the result that they became completely effeminate. When they were then attacked by aggressors, they failed and were subjugated. Secretly, they then begat those capable of fighting and carried out the genetic manipulations on them, out of which the new races with different skin colors arose in the underground, who were then used against the aggressors and also triumphed against them. So the producer rulers themselves were to blame for their degeneration and begat new humans out of the resulting misery, who actually possessed all the natural prerequisites again and were therefore able to fight and survive. But this was not enough for the creator rulers, which is why they carried out the genetic manipulations to make the new peoples more aggressive than they were by nature. In a certain sense, they simply reinforced certain factors through genetic manipulation, whereby the manipulated ones became actual combat machines, but still were provided with the possibility of being able to normalize themselves in a controlling manner through evolution, which however required periods of millions of years, and therefore still continues today, which is evident in terrestrial humans. Through genetic manipulation, the negative, or the evil, as the terrestrial human being generally understands it, had been particularly strongly and unnaturally aggressively shaped at that time, which is why it has not yet been so strongly degraded in terrestrial human beings today that they could not get very badly out of control of the good human nature again, in every respect, and thus in the excessive procreation of offspring, which has led to overpopulation and all resulting evils of all kinds, as well as to religious sectarian madness and nonsense in many fanatical forms, whereby ultimately not only the destruction of the planet threatens, but also the destruction of the entire environment and of life in all forms at all. This thinking and acting of the Earth human represents a relapse phase into the original state of genetic manipulation, whereby, as in the early days, everything degenerates and becomes rampant, which is why the creator rulers at that time also saw a further reason in eliminating the genetically manipulated ones again. This relapse phase is particularly strong today when it comes to military and revolutionary concerns, as well as religious sectarian machinations. Through the military training as well as through the political smear campaigns and the religious sectarian fanaticism and criminality of all kinds, control over the positive is lost, which is swallowed up and suppressed by the negative, out of which, in turn, a state of intoxication of negative evil develops, which is uncontrollably succumbed to and indulged. In earlier times, the human beings of female and male form were of the same kind in terms of viability, fighting ability, and fighting power, etc., etc. So there were no differences between men and women in this respect, not even with regard to the fields of work and the work to be done, although it was the case that the physically weaker women were replaced by the men in jobs that were too heavy for them. Thus, women and men were equal in every respect, without any differences, apart from the biological differences and the resulting peculiarities, etc., which of course had to be taken into account in primeval times. Thus, even at that time, women had to fulfill their primary duties of motherhood and the household, if they were married, and if they had offspring. If this was not the case, however, then the women carried out the same activities as the men. Thus, they were also active in government positions, whereby, however, the male powers were included in the form that men and women governed in equal numbers and carried the responsibility in each case, so that one man or woman alone did not hold the power of government, whereby the people themselves also had a right of co-determination and co-decision for all concerns, resolutions and regulations as well as laws, etc. As has already been explained, in the Sol system 2 planets were suitable for the refugees, the genetically manipulated ones, Mars and Phaeton. The Earth was still quite inhospitable and the atmosphere was such that, at that time, it was quite detrimental to the human life forms from the Sirius regions, which is why only those fallible genetically manipulated ones, who became aggressive and malicious against their own allies, were abandoned on this planet. At that time, 5 races, or the remnants that continued to be persecuted, had fled from the Sirius regions to Mars, while 2 other races fled beyond the Sun to the other side of the galaxy, as has already been explained. In addition to the 5 races that fled to Mars and Phaeton, there were also 2 different races from the creator rulers, which of course were not genetically engineered, and therefore had no changes in genetic information. These 2 races were the benevolent ones who were well disposed towards the genetically manipulated ones and helped them escape. They themselves came from 2 different planets in the Sirius regions, which were completely overpopulated, which is why there was a ban on procreation, as a result of which all children were killed if any were born, despite the ban, while the parents who contravened the ban were sterilized and sent into exile. The flight from the Sirius regions took a very long time and dragged on for many thousands of years before the refugees, constantly hounded by their persecutors, were finally able to escape from their reach and sight and found the appropriate hiding place in the Sol system. The same was true of the 2 peoples who settled on the other side of the galaxy. Both refugee groups, however, had it in common that over the many years which were spent mostly in the spaceships crisscrossing the galaxy, revolts and power struggles broke out, the consequence of which being that not only all knowledge and all references to the origin of the genetically manipulated ones were lost, but also terrible dramas came to light, which led to the outbreak of cannibalism, which spread to all spaceships. So all references to the origin of the gene-manipulated ones, and thus of the later terrestrial humans, were lost just as much as the knowledge about the abilities and knowledge of these humans. Also belonging to the loss of all knowledge was the knowledge about the natural laws and recommendations of the creation. A great confusion arose, which again led to new difficulties, although the danger of persecution was always known, because this threat was passed on from generation to generation. The gene-manipulated ones who finally settled on Mars and Melona and their well-meaning trader-creator rulers developed a technologically superior culture over time, but this did not prevent them from one day having to flee the planet again. This happened as a result of the scientists one day realizing that the Sol system was much more unsafe from a purely cosmic point of view than was originally assumed, because many comets and wandering planets as well as meteors, etc. endangered the two newly settled planets Mars and Melona/Phaeton over and over again, whereby such rushing space rocks also crashed down on the planet several times and caused immense damage, as well as destroying countless human lives. Subsequently, a large wandering planet was discovered, which had an unusually long orbital period and traveled far beyond the outermost planets of the solar system. This large celestial body, the astronomical scientists calculated, threatened to collide with the planet Mars, or at least to destroy it by a near collision in such a manner that all life on the planet would be completely destroyed and annihilated. Thus all flora and fauna, as well as all human life. So the gene-manipulated ones and their distant descendants on Mars were advised to give up their place of exile, which these distant descendants still regarded as such, because they were still aware of the danger of persecution, but already in an unclear form, from which they were no longer able to define the origin of the danger. But the threatening wandering planet had been destructive in the Sol system for a long time and had already caused a lot of trouble. According to the information given by Svath early on, this celestial body was the destroyer that had caused the most devastating destruction on the Plejaran homeworlds at a very early stage, before it then shot off on its unpredictable orbit through the world space to establish itself in the Sol system, where it has also caused much disaster since then. Over time, his orbital period of several thousand years decreased to an average of 575.5 years, which in the meantime has increased again due to the influence of the Pleiadian Plejaran on it, so that it can be expected again in about 1,180 years in the Sol system. Thus, the Pleiadian/Plejaran were not able to bring it completely off, of course, as this was actually planned, but at least the orbit and orbit time could be changed in such a manner that at least, for the time being, there is no danger anymore, because normally it would have had to return in the year 2255 with devastating consequences of destruction. The Pleiadian Plejaran were not allowed to take the Wanderer off course or destroy it in any other manner, because the High Council asked them to refrain from doing so, because the destruction or any other course determination would have caused even greater destruction, which might have affected the Earth as well. Note Ptah from 5th January 2005. The destroyer was taken off course in the late 1990s of the 20th century and is now on its way to the outermost ring belt of the Sol system, where it will remain for all time and no longer return to the inner solar system. In the elaboration of the new possibilities of emigration, there was again dispute among the distant descendants of the genetically manipulated ones, into whom the genetic manipulation by inheritance was also transferred. The decisive factor for the outbreak of the quarrels was, to a not inconsiderable extent, a new doctrine, which was created by the well-meaning ones, who said that they, the well-meaning ones, were the creators of the gene-manipulated ones or their distant descendants, to whom absolute obedience and worship had to be paid, for they were the highest existing ones, namely the creators and producers. This, however, was not the opinion and demand of all well-disposed people, which resulted in two different camps, one being the camp of the alleged creators, and the other, the camp of those who remained well-disposed in every respect and distanced themselves from a creatorship. So there was a dispute between these two camps on the one hand, and between the followers or believers of the two parties on the other. In the end, the disputants agreed that all those who were willing to do so should simply leave the planet Mars for the Earth and Melona. So it happened that many human beings from both camps finally joined forces to emigrate together, one to the planet Melona/Phaeton, and the other to the Earth. The emigration leader to Melona was a certain Zentikon equals the strong leader, who was assisted by his wife Amalaka equals she goes her way. The emigration leader to the Earth was also two, namely a certain Samos equals who looks at things, and his brother Passas equals keeper of freedom. While the atmosphere on Melona was breathable and healthy for the emigrants and for the peoples already living there, and corresponded roughly to that of Mars, which was as much as that which the descendants of the genetically manipulated ones were used to in their spaceships over many millennia, this did not apply to the Earth. So purposeful changes had to be made if the emigrants were to live on the Earth in the future. So the same event happened that was already important when the degenerated ones on the Earth were abandoned. At that time, the abandoned ones were first subjected to an adaptation to the Earth's atmosphere, and their bone structure was more strongly stabilized, etc., before they were transferred to the Earth. This happened now equally with all emigration willing from Mars, before they could establish themselves on the Earth. Then everything came to be as the scientists had predicted. The destroyer invaded the Mars orbit and tore it away with it into another SOL orbit, whereby it was from now on in the same orbit as the planet Melona, which migrated then, however, later, likewise by the forces of violence of the destroyer, in order to live its existence there, where it was then destroyed many thousands of years later by his inhabitants, in order to become the asteroid belt. The inhabitants of Melona were decimated by the emigration catastrophe at that time, from about 470 million people to about 14 million, after which they recovered again and had a population of about 52 million people again with their planet destruction. Those who emigrated to the Earth lost contact with Melona and Mars, which had become completely desolate, and on which all those left behind had perished. But those of the well-meaning ones who let themselves be glorified and worshipped by the new doctrine as creators vehemently spread their irrational doctrine further and did not let the still well-meaning good, meaning get their chance anymore. Thus the creator rulers, who now presented themselves as the creators of the Earth humans, were able to seize all power and spread their mistaken doctrine of faith, which also contained an absolutely new but equally false history of human origin and faith, whereby the real origin, should it still have glowed secretly somewhere, was finally destroyed and lost. Of course, those who were still truly well-meaning could not simply put up with this, but defended themselves against this in such a form that they too invented doctrines of belief and spread them among the new current Earth humans, in the hope that they would fathom out the real truth through the new forms of belief, and understand and comprehend that which is truly creational and natural, whereby there was also the hope that everything would turn back to the good, which is why the saying of the really well-meaning ones was also coined at that time. The teaching shall be made for the sake of the kind of human beings on the Earth, because of their desecrated body, to destroy the impure and degenerate in it. In this teaching, as in the teachings of the creator-producer rulers, there was also hidden the meaning that the various faiths and doctrines of faith would form an enormous obstacle, whereby the distant descendants of the genetically manipulated ones would keep their numbers in tolerable and responsible masses, in order to, on the one hand, not go against the will of the creator, producer rulers, and also not go against those who are still well-meaning, in order to become master over them, etc., and on the other hand, not to develop prematurely in such a form that they could fly out again into space via a too fast and too highly developed technology in order to find their former homeworlds again, like Mars and the Sirius area planets, etc. On the part of the creators, there was also the hope that the Earth humans would let themselves be beaten into confusion and wars by the different faith teachings in order to exterminate themselves in this way. At least, however, the hope was anchored in the fact that the Earth humans would only then be technically, biologically and scientifically capable again to conquer space, if they had made the necessary changes in their thinking and acting through a sufficiently long period of evolution. The Earth humans should therefore also be brought to insight by the faith teachings and faith directions of the most diverse kind, in order to solve their problem of the genetically manipulated degeneration and to correct this degeneration, whereby, not least, the factor should be important that the Earth humans find the genetically manipulated damage themselves one day, in the most distant future, and form it back to normal through a corresponding genetic reversion. Only then, so the view and hope was, should the distant descendants of the gene-manipulated ones, the terrestrial humans, seek contact with their actual past and origin as well as with the universe, to other worlds and other humans in the expanses of the Milky Way and foreign galaxies. Thus everything says that the Earth humans will quickly develop themselves further, because for a long time more and more humans have been born who are devoted to evolution, in every respect. Thus, the former hopes of the well-meaning ones will also be fulfilled, that blameless and peaceful races will come to the Earth from the vastness of the universe, and keep in contact with the Earth humans, but only when the unfortunate chain of genetic manipulation is reversed and normalized in a logical form, and the human DNA is again creationally naturally connected in a manner that corresponds to that which is creational. Thus it is already pre-programmed that the unfortunate genetic manipulation in the DNA chain will be discovered and found by the Earth humans, even if this will only happen in a certain future. And thus it is also already certain that this mistake, which is forcibly attached to humanity, will also be reversed by themselves, which has kept them from real humanity and the creational natural laws and recommendations and their fulfillment many times to this day, so that only a few have been able to find the right way in the most laborious work so far and to defeat the degeneracy caused by genetic manipulation on the natural path of evolution. Thus everything on the Earth is oriented towards eliminating genetic manipulation, after which humanity can leave the solar system again, before the sun dies and the entire system is doomed to extinction, which happens much earlier than is claimed by current Earth scientists, because SOL is truly already a dying star. And when the human beings once again emigrate from the Earth and acclimatize to new home planets far and wide away from the Sol system, they will have to adapt to the new atmospheric conditions, just like their ancestors of the primeval great ancestors, which will again be the same as they were before primeval times, when the genetically manipulated humans still breathed their beneficial air. And it can already be said today that these once distant descendants of the Earth humans will have a tremendous and good future ahead of them. It will still take a number of years before the Earth humanity will find proof that its former ancestors from primordial times came from foreign solar and planetary systems to the Sol system and settled on Mars before they emigrated to the Earth. It is also likely that the first evidence will then be found that the ancestors of the earliest times, the genetically manipulated ones and their descendants, were refugees and exiled ones who originally came from the Sirius regions. This evidence will shake not only the scientific world, but above all the religious world of all kinds, whereby then very much must be changed. This will happen especially when artifacts of a certain earlier humanity are found, of which pyramids and sculptures, such as the so-called faces of Mars, will not be part of the findings. The findings and the message to the human beings of the Earth will one day be the factors that lead to the collapse of the fable picture about their origins that was assembled by the early ancestors of the Earth humans, and that suddenly many truth vultures come to the frightening realization that the Earth human, on the one hand, does not originally come from the planet Earth, and on the other hand, is not the sole human form of life in the universe. In order to explain the facts about the Pleiadians or Pleiaren and the Old Lyrans, the following must be said: the Pleiadians/Pleiaren, as distant descendants of the Old Lyrans, have no contact whatsoever with the serious intelligences or with today's descendants of the former creator rulers, neither with the positive nor with the negative species. Such contacts are also not planned for the time being, neither for the present nor for the near future. Nevertheless, the ring of the two lines should one day be closed again, which, however, will be only then or at the earliest when the genetic manipulations have been reversed. Because only at that time the descendants of the former producer rulers will be evolutively so highly developed that the Pleiadian Pleiaren will be able to make contact with them. This also applies to the serious intelligences, who are completely different human races outside the Henok lineage of origin and have no degree of kinship in any wise. Today's Pleiadians, that is to say Pleiaren, as well as today's Lyran and today's Dal universe peoples of the Henok Nokodemion lineage, that is to say Nokodemion, Henok lineage, are among those human life forms who are so highly developed in consciousness-based and spiritual form that they can no longer come into contact with less developed human life forms, as Earth humans and the Sirius area dwellers and many other human races on other worlds are, without being endangered by the low swinging waves of the underdeveloped of life. On the other hand, their laws also forbid them to make contact with and interfere in the affairs of such underdeveloped humans, because it would dangerously disrupt the self-evolution of the underdeveloped ones. Every human form of life, as well as every other form of life, must evolve itself by its own power, whereby only certain knowledge and information, etc., may be fed to it in an impulse-based manner by higher forms of life, which, on the one hand, are not recognized as such, and on the other hand, do not offer the possibility of attaining greater and more comprehensive knowledge and possibilities than the lower level of evolution permits. The reason for the Pleiadians/Pleiaren not being in contact with the descendants of the former creator rulers in the Sirius regions and in other places where they live, as well as with the actual Sirius intelligences, is therefore also to be found therein. When long ago the old Lyrans came to Earth and began to work here among the Earth humans, whose actual origin was elsewhere, as has already been explained several times, they chose times when the positive as well as the negative creator rulers, or their distant descendants, were not present in the Sol system, and thus also not on the Earth, or had already moved away again. The old Lyrans, and also later the Pleiadian Pleiaren, were always anxious not to encounter the creator rulers or their descendants, because, on the one hand, they wanted to go their own ways, and on the other hand, they would inevitably have been involved in warlike actions with the other Henok lineage as a result of the differentiated worldview, which had ultimately led to the breeding of the genetically manipulated ones by the producer rulers, which was condemned by the ancient Syrians just as deeply as their descendants, the Pleiadians/Pleiaren, do. Since then, any contact with the Sirius inhabitants of the Henok lineage has been avoided, as have contacts with the actual Ur-Sirius intelligences, who were no better than the other inhabitants. On the other hand, the old Lyrans were already further advanced in their evolution than the Sirius area inhabitants of the other Henok lineage and the actual Sirius intelligences. So for this reason alone, contacts were out of the question, because such contacts would have been too dangerous for life and limb. The old Lyrans were still quite warlike and scheming, etc., but at the same time they were not denied the evolution of consciousness and mind, except for those who did not fit into the evolution by force, and therefore had to leave the Lyra Vega areas, etc., and came into the Sol system. But among them were also well-disposed ones and evolutionists who took the sacrifice to go with the fugitives in order to teach them further and to bring them on the right path of humanity and evolution, which they succeeded in doing in the course of time, even if many things went wrong again and again. And these old Syrians then mixed with the Earth humans, just as the descendants of the creator rulers from the Sirius regions had done before. And therefore the descendants of the old Syrians were also hereditarily confronted with genetic manipulation and affected like all other humans on the Earth. This happened in a relatively short time, because already after about 3,000 years, no human life form could be found on the Earth that had not been genetically manipulated. This was true both for the 144,210 leaders, sub-leaders, and the very positive spirit leaders, who voluntarily took everything upon themselves to teach the refugee people the teaching of the spirit, etc., as well as for the several million of the normal humans. This made it possible that since then not a single human life form has existed on the Earth that would not carry the legacy of the degeneration of the negative and the positive, only depending on how the balance is achieved in the individual human being, although degenerations often come to light, both in negative and positive form. Even though the ancient Lyrans were, in a certain wise, already far evolutionarily, they still lacked the observance of the creational natural laws, as a result of which they very often disobeyed them and wreaked havoc, which, however, referred only to those few million who had to flee from their home worlds. They also acted equally on the Earth, which led them to adopt the religions invented by the descendants of the creator rulers, and to rise up to become creator gods in order to cast their spell over the Earth humans. Thus the old Lyrans were not the actual inventors and founders of the original religions with their god-creators and creator gods, but they were only the unscrupulous beneficiaries of the equally unscrupulous creator-ruler descendants. Through the religious legends and fables of religion, as well as fables of gods and fables of world origin, etc., which were brought into being, on the one hand, to cover up the real origin of the SOL system humans from Mars, Melona, and the Earth, and to let them fall into oblivion so that they would not one day find their way back to the Sirius regions, and on the other hand, so that quarrels and wars would arise among the genetically manipulated precisely through the religions, whereby they should exterminate themselves, so that they could never come up again and start their way back to their original homeland. The ancient Lyran Vegans became better sensed with time, and so they began to follow the teaching of the spirit, and thus the creational natural laws and recommendations, whereby their entire evolution rapidly leapt forward and lifted them up high. As a result, they were even more careful not to come into contact with the creator-ruler descendants, or with the Sirius intelligences in any manner. So they retreated to the home planets after a peace agreement with the inhabitants of the home planets, while another group withdrew into another dimension beyond the constellation of the Pleiades. So they remained as far away from this dimension as the old Lyran Vegans and those who found a new home beyond the constellation of the Hyades, about 150 light-years distance from the Earth. A third group left our universe, the Dern universe, and penetrated into the twin universe, into the DAL universe, where the peoples multiplied and united with many other peoples to form a huge federation, as it also happened with the Pleiadians/Pleiaren, whose federation exists offset to our space-time continuum by a fraction of a second and covers an area of about 70 million light-years in diameter, whereby also some few Federation members, respectively Federation planets, are located in our space-time continuum.
We were just talking about those who had played an important role up to that point, namely the three groups that we had discussed in one of our last conversations. In addition to these, there are a few other groups of extraterrestrial origin that fly to Earth and can be observed here more often, but none of which is in contact with any Earth humans, neither on a private nor on a military or governmental basis. Some of them come to Earth purely for excursions or expeditions. Others have other interests, but none in the way that the hysterical Americans portray this, with the impregnation of Earth women by Earth alien intelligences, or the impregnation of Earth alien women by men of Earth. The nonsense about massacring animals, etc., can also be forgotten, for such things do not apply either. Those who have interests other than those of an excursion or expedition will make a name for themselves on Earth in the distant future. But why this will be so, we must keep quiet about it, which of course also applies to you, who are informed about these distant things of the future. The government itself, which actually conceals and keeps under lock and key much important evidence for the existence of extraterrestrial life and their appearance on the Earth, as well as forbids by laws the contact with extraterrestrial life forms.
In my 23 pages, I forgot to mention something else. Namely, that Earth humans were actually a single race in Henok's primeval times, out of which further races formed through climatic changes, atmospheric changes, and secretions, resulting in new lines. These then intermingled with each other, creating new breeds again. Thus, in the course of time, both the skin colors of humans and their external appearance changed, always in adaptation to the new environment and the new living conditions, etc. Of course, this also resulted in genetic changes, apart from genetic manipulation. These, however, were not such that the origin and basic connection of the fact that all human beings on the Earth originated from a single ancestral tribe would no longer be apparent. When, about 190,000 years ago, the human beings of the Lyra regions, etc., settled on the Earth with the former immigrants and the former humans of the world, it would be impossible to see the origin and the basic connection between them. Their descendants joined again immediately, and when the peoples separated again in bigger surges and the most different areas of the Earth were repopulated, new changes occurred in the skin color as well as in the external appearance and in the genes, whereby nevertheless also this time the ancestral strain was preserved, whereby still today it can be proven genetically that the terrestrial humans originated from a single primeval race.
The rule also applies on all our Federation worlds, that hardly anything can be done against heavy earthquakes in a reasonable form, if high buildings, etc., are erected, which is why only small buildings are usual everywhere and largely secured against heavy shocks. Also, our worlds live and are shaken by earthquakes, but we behave accordingly in the construction of the buildings and in their protection against the shaking of the planets.
You also have houses or buildings that are not composed of small pieces, such as stones or concrete slabs, etc., because your buildings are made of plastics and also of a single piece, seamlessly, as I have seen. In addition, they are on spring systems, which are made as suspended bodies.
That is correct, but these are only two of the methods used as vibration protections.
But just tell me how far your research and experiments have advanced with the latest travel and transport technology.
It is all still full of failures, and it will take quite some time before everything really works properly. There have also been unexpected new problems again. But if everything works perfectly, then we will be able to visit you more often because we do not have to get to Earth and you in an awkward manner anymore, but can do this without all the loss of time and so on. As it looks, according to your terms, this may take a little longer, maybe 2 to 3 years.
Your world monitoring control discs, what about them? Do they remain stationed around the world?
All these control apparatuses have already been removed, so only the one intended for the center still exists. But it is no larger than 7 millimeters in diameter and 3.2 millimeters in thickness.
And that includes all the monitoring electronics as well as the signal transmitter?
And even much more that you would not dream of, as you like to say. The control apparatus also contains transmitters and receivers and associated image transmission equipment, which transmit everything at multiple speeds of light to a control point near our dimensional passage at a star far beyond the Pleiades cluster, in order to reach our space-time structure, and thus our dimension from there through a dimensional transmitter. For security reasons, I am unfortunately not allowed to explain this anymore.
You mean probably for safety reasons in relation to other space-traveling intelligences?
Certainly. More detailed information would be dangerous for us.
You are once again tight-lipped. My friend. You mean probably that certain Earth visitors of other worlds outside of our solar system could get hold of your information and find the way into your dimension.
That is the meaning of my words, yes. At least from a group of such intelligences, we know that they are capable of changing dimensions in such a kind and wise that they could reach our dimension, which would be unpleasant.
I did not know that. Do these intelligences also come to the Earth?
That is the case, yes. They come only sporadically to the Earth.